Hello from the Hanover Historical Society and Howe Library. That was Megan from Howe Library. We're pleased to have this partnership with the Howe Library, and we hope to keep bringing history to you, local, national, global history. We look forward to a year of programs and the reopening of Webster Cottage. That's the historic building that volunteers run on the Dartmouth campus, and that'll be open in the summer and fall. Our first visitors will be little people. The fourth graders from our local elementary school will be on field trips to study the artifacts in the building. So if any of you are interested, that's on Zoom or here, in helping us with any of these projects, please let me know. My email is bittingercynthia1@gmail.com. Also, we will be co-sponsoring a program here April 1st that will be moved and seconded town meeting in New Hampshire. Rebecca Rule is the presenter. Now, Rebecca evidently has been telling stories about New Hampshire on her show on NHPBS, Our Hometown. So you might have heard about that. But tonight we have the honor of hosting Bill Hammond. He is our wonderful teacher and principal who has worked with so many of our young people in the area. My daughter calls him one of the best teachers she ever had. Bill has taught math, English, and drama at Hanover High School for 30 years and was a principal at Marion Cross School. He is involved in many organizations and even reenacts Daniel Webster for July 4th activities when I request that. He does that when he's not riding his unicycle. Sometimes I think he does both, Daniel Webster and unicycle. Please welcome Bill with his story about his father. Some of us are very interested in what he has to say. He's had a long tour with his brothers and did an awful lot of research. Come ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Cindy. Very nice introduction. So on May 7th, 1945, the day of Germany's unconditional surrender to the Allies in World War II in Europe, a conscripted Polish farm worker came up to a mess sergeant in Company K because he heard that that mess sergeant knew a little Polish and was from the Chicago area, and said, "My wife and I have been working on this farm in Germany, and we had a son 7 months ago, and we were unable to baptize our son. We'd like to baptize our son." And so the mess sergeant said to him, "I don't know if I can do anything, but let's go talk to the old man." The old man was the company commander. He was my father. He was 30 years old at the time. And with the jubilation about the war ending and the excitement about helping this family, he said, "We passed the Catholic Church about an hour south of here. Jump in the Jeep, we'll go down, we'll get your child baptized. Oh, and by the way, if you want, I'll be his godfather." So the Polish family said yes right away. They went down, and my dad became his godfather. So the old man, my old man, was quite reluctant to talk about World War II with us as we were growing up. He told some stories. He told stories that he thought were funny, or he would tell stories about indirectly things that happened so that he could speak in French or speak a little German. And we often were curious about where those languages came from, and they were from his time in the war. When I thought about whether or not he wanted to talk about it, I was thinking, who would really want to spend time recounting the most harrowing moments of your life? There were a lot of things that happened that he did not talk about. There were a lot of things that we found out that happened that he was participating in that I would not have wanted to talk about myself. So for years, my siblings and I talked about maybe honoring and thanking my father for the work that he'd done as a person in World War II, as a soldier in World War II, by taking a trip to follow his footsteps. And to do that, we had to figure out where he was and where he'd gone and what he did. So today I'm just going to talk about some of the highlights of the journey and what we discovered about my father. Now, how many of you here have somebody who is connected with World War II? Yeah, most of you. It's impressive and daunting in a way about how many people were involved in that war. But the reason for giving this talk is that you might conceive in some way, I know some of you have, Adina has written a book about this, but in some way, being able to follow the footsteps of your own relative or friend or person, and it doesn't just have to be war, it could be something else. It was a great way of just reacquainting ourselves with my dad. So I want to tell you how we got this information, what we did, and who went. These are my two of my brothers. I come from a very big family. I come from a family of 12 kids. And yeah, exactly. And the reason for that, my dad would say, he said he got married after World War II, came back, and he and my mom met, and they got married in 1947. I'm sorry, 1946. Brother was born in 1947. He said, you know, we figured that that was the worst the world would ever be. And so we just wanted to share it with as many people as possible as the world got better. And if you're going to have a big family, that's a good reason for doing it, right? Whether it's accurate or not. Okay. So I'm the ninth child. Jean is number 1, and George is number 4. So I say we're the squares of the family. So when we first decided to do this, we went on Google and figured out from the Texas Military Museum where the 142nd Regiment went. So we got that piece of information, but it was pretty general, and the 142nd Regiment had a number of different companies in it. And so we didn't know exactly when my dad was in different places, but we knew about what path he had taken from North Africa up through Italy, up through France, and into Germany, down into Austria. That was the general path we knew about already. But then about 6 months before we left, my sister found in some of his old boxes a bunch of letters that he wrote to his mother while he was overseas. And from those, we were able to take the dates of where he was, the dates of the letters to the places where he was, and triangulate that to what we already knew about what the path was. And then we also, within these letters, because the letters couldn't be too specific about where he was, he often said somewhere in Italy or somewhere in Germany. But then he would mention things that happened. For example, when he was in Italy, he said, we saw Vesuvius erupting last night. So we were able to go back into geological history and find out at what point did Vesuvius erupt. And then we would be able to say, oh, he was with this wave of the 142nd Regiment because they had only gotten as far as Vesuvius at that point. So we got all those. Besides that, he got 2 silver stars and 2 purple hearts. And there were descriptions of what had happened and where. And so we were able to take that information too. But that was all the information we had. It was a lot, but it was all we had. And a lot of times we just had to recognize that we had imperfect, imprecise information and we had to improvise. And that was part of the fun. We would talk about, all right, so what do we do now? Where do we go next? So when we started, when we started, we flew into Naples down here and started in Salerno. He had gone to North Africa for final training here and came into Salerno in 1944. Worked his way up the Italian centerland. You know, he ended up in casino and things like that. And then they took a boat from back to Naples up into San Rafael Beach, and this is where they landed, went up through France, went into Germany, down into Austria. Eventually, after the war ended, he went over to Camp Lucky Strike to get sent back to the United States. So that was his final move. When he first came to Salerno, they didn't have to fight their way onto the beach. There was no fighting at that point. We know that from his letters, that he talked about not being baptized yet, that the people were coming off the front line, and he said, they look a lot different from us. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with us, but we know that there are people who are going through a lot. So it wasn't long before they were starting to force back the front line. In letter number 7, for example, he talked about what it might be like once they got into battle. And this is what he said. This is an excerpt from letter number 7. This is April 9th, 1944, somewhere in Italy. The Germans really used the scorched earth policy. And we don't do a bad job ourselves of destroying buildings, etc., where the Jerry gets firmly entrenched, Jerry referring to Germans. Thank God that the war never reached the US. It's a mess and leaves people in such a hopeless condition. We see and hear plenty, but that will have to wait. Read the papers, but realize that it is written for the consumption of the public. War is not as glamorous as they'd have you believe, and it is not as widespread as it indicates. Fighting war is a science, and science develops slowly. So a man is not always dodging shells, even though he's on the front lines. Life goes on merrily a few blocks away. So when we came into Italy, we ended up going to Salerno, which looked a lot like Lake Michigan, which is where we grew up, Kenosha, Wisconsin, and wondered if he had made that. And then we ended up going to the city of Avellino because he had a picture of himself as a soldier in Avellino. Avellino was a place of one of the horrible battles in the war. 1 in 8 citizens died in Avellino. 1 in 8 citizens died. So if you think about that, just in terms of Upper Valley population, you might say, you know, all of Lebanon, with everybody in Lebanon was killed, with just the local Upper Valley population. We went to and started at a place that was a photography studio. We figured, we've got a photo, let's go to the photography studio to see if they can explain anything. We knew that they wouldn't be able to give us a whole lot of information, but it gave us a point where we could start talking to people. And as they told us about things that were in Avellino that we might see, we bumped into things too. We had this happen a lot, where there are war memorials in a lot of different places. And one of the war memorials in Avellino had all the soldiers that were killed from Avellino, but it also had all the civilians that were killed in Avellino. And that was pretty breathtaking to see that right there. And it turned out that it was put together by the local Lions Club, so a community service organization that thought this is something that really needs to be remembered. So we went to Avellino, and then we continued on. That's what he looked like at the beginning. Remember that picture? That was the Avellino. I don't see any, furrows on his face at this point. We continued on. We went through Monte Cassino, and we went up to Anzio, where there is a cemetery, the Sicily Roman American Cemetery Memorial in the Tuno. We bumped into two friends there. I don't know if anybody knows Emo and Roger Ulrich. They used to live in Norwich. They had moved over there, and they said, "Oh, you should come up here and take a look at this." So they got us an after-hours tour of the cemetery that looks quite a bit like Normandy with the crosses. Those are the grave markers in the Tuno. And then ultimately, we went to Rome because Dad mentioned in one of the letters that he got 4 days off, and it was the first time he was in a bed and was very excited that he was able to sleep in a bed and stay in a hotel for a few days. Right. From Italy, we landed here at San Rafael Beach. And the San Rafael Beach landing was not like the Salerno landing. They were met with forces right away. So they were in coming up through Italy, actually letter number 12, just before they went to France, they said, somewhere in Italy, this was June 28th, 44. So the Jerry myth is beginning to tumble. The only way they've been able to survive so far is by robbing the populace where they are. They move into an area, clear all the Italians out of their house and take over. They kill all the food they want to eat, as well as pigs, cows, etc. Use anything in the house or outside of the house, such as cows, wagons, horses, etc., and don't care what happens to anything. From this standpoint, they are truly barbarians. Many times a German-occupied house will be included in our objective. And while they kill the chicken, pick it, and fry it, we arrive so soon that we eat it. They had to take off in such a hurry, they just leave the table set, and we move right in and enjoy it. Wow. They aren't bad cooks either. I've had some of their coffee they had brewing and had to wait for it to cool off. So olive war is not too bad. There are compensations, but the big one will be when it quits and we can get back to somewhat of a normal life again. There will be many scars from this war. On human mentality, I mean. The physical disabilities are bad enough, but a person has to be rough and tough, both physically and mentally, to withstand the things he has to do and things he sees, or he'd miss the boat entirely. The Americans are doing it and doing it well, with few exceptions. I wouldn't say that all are brave. Anybody who isn't scared is a fool. But we are all well trained and have confidence in our weapons, in ourselves, and in our pals to fight well. So a person sees very little outward fear, even when things get fairly rough. Everybody continues to do their job with an inconceivable calmness. I guess everybody figures that God will see to it that we'll get it if it's our turn. And if it isn't, we'll just have to carry on as best we can. So one of the things we three brothers kept trying to do as we were driving from place to place is talk to each other and try to get into the mentality of what my dad must have been thinking or feeling or doing as a way of connecting with him, connecting with each other, and recognizing that the lives we've lived, devoid of war personally, of being involved in those wars, how much different our mentality would be, and how much different his mentality would be. Why was it that having gone through this awful situation, why did he choose to do what he did, ultimately with his life? So the landing in France, when they landed in France, they were with a Navy boat captain, bringing them in. And there was a point where the guy said, I'm not going in any further. They're all shooting. And so you guys have got to get off the boat now, 10 feet of water, and work your way in to packs. And my dad said, that's not going to happen. Bring us in all the way to the beach, bring us in so that these guys have a chance to survive on this landing. So eventually the guy relented, and they got in all the way to the beach. They had to, from all the way up through France, they were fighting from place to place to place to place. And interestingly, of all the letters that we found, there were letters from Italy, there were letters from Germany, there were no letters from France. And I don't know if that's because the letters were lost or because it was so intense during that time that they were going through France that they didn't have as much time to write or send something. So we went to France, and almost right away we went to the cemetery in Draguignan, which is very close to the beach landing just up. At another of these many cemeteries that just remember the people who passed away. Some people sent their family's remains back to the United States, but many had their remains buried in Italy or France or Germany. And so we wanted to keep going and figure out where to go through France. So we kept going, much rural territory. And we got up to a place to Remiremont. And there were a couple of plaques there that were just stunning. My two brothers had gone to sleep, and I decided to go out into the cemetery just because I thought it might be an interesting place to get some information. And on this big obelisk, there was this à la mémoire. It was a dedication to the Jews of Remiremont, ages 10 months to 80 years, who died after being deported to Auschwitz. So we kept going north. This is where we landed. We kept going north, and right up here, we decided was about the place where the battle where he got his first Silver Star had happened. We did that by taking a look at where the 142nd Regiment was, where Company K was at the time, and what happened with the Silver Star citation. So this is the first Silver Star citation. That Eugene R. Hammond, First Lieutenant, 142nd Regiment, for gallantry in action on 9th and 10th of November, 1944 in France. While returning to friendly lines, a combat patrol consisting of 2 platoons was fired on by 5 enemy machine guns. I mean, just imagine being in that situation. So you're coming up, you've got your platoon with you, and you've got 5 enemy machine guns all aiming at you. So the platoons were fired on by the 5 enemy machine guns, and the leader was wounded. Lieutenant Hammond assumed command and led an attack on the enemy positions. He destroyed a machine gun and machine pistol emplacement with 2 hand grenades. Efforts to penetrate the German lines failed. Darkness fell, and because the supply of ammunition was low, the situation was critical. Lieutenant Hammond then led the group over 2,000 yards of rugged terrain through a blinding snowstorm to the shelter of a farmhouse from which contact was made with friendly forces. By his courage and outstanding leadership, Lieutenant Hammond successfully destroyed a hostile machine gun emplacement and led a large patrol safely back from behind enemy lines. So we had that information. We wanted to figure out, RSA, where was this? How could we find this? So we decided that we would just, as best we could, get down to this area and see if we could find this farmhouse or, find, that's all the information we had. So we were driving along and we got to a rotary. And at the rotary, we thought the best choice would be to go off the uh, first exit from the rotary. And we got a little ways up the road and Google said, no, you're on the wrong road. All right, so we went back and we went off the second one. And it didn't take too long for Google to tell us we were off again. Third, fourth, we went all four exits from this rotary. And no matter where we went, it said we were off. And so we were trying to figure out, now what do we do? Because if no matter which exit we take, we're not on this path to find out where this place happened. We went around the rotary again and we noticed that there was this little alley just off the rotary up into a little town. And we said, well, let's try that. It was barely wide enough for the car to fit in. And we went up there and Google says, okay, we go up through the town a little bit. This can't possibly be the place. Google says, it's okay. So we went through this little town, just barely making it through the road, and got up to this national forest. And it was the national forest that Google said, you're on the right track. So the road going into the national forest wasn't wide enough for two cars to pass. It was about 1.5. If any car was coming in the other direction, you'd have to pull over, but we never saw a single car coming in the other direction. So we went along this road for a while and there was nothing. I mean, this is a national forest. It was trees, it was fields, but it was nothing that we thought, how can we find rugged terrain or anything that had to do with this first Silver Star? So just as we were about to give up on this, we come up over this little hill.
Oh.
And there was a farmhouse, one farmhouse, with a barn that was big enough to sleep 2 platoons. We don't know if this was the farmhouse, but it was the only building on the road. And so we decided, here's George, here's Gene. We decided to go across from there because up here, there was rugged terrain. There was a forest. And so we went up there and read the citation. And we didn't meet anybody here. It was a working farm still because there were chicks and ducks and turkeys enclosed in these pens, but there was nobody there at that time. So that was one of the kind of moments of serendipity in this trip that I thought, all right, somebody's paying attention here. So then we decided to look for the locale of his second Silver Star, which they call an oak leaf cluster. And it was in Germany. I mentioned that first one was in November of 1944. This was 5 months later, in March of 1945. And we knew it was in Germany. And this is what the citation said. For gallantry in action on March 20th, 1945 in Germany. As the men of Company K neared the crest of a hill, they were subjected to intense machine gun fire and rifle fire from trenches and pillboxes 25 yards away. So imagine a football field. 1/4 of that football field was how far away these people were firing. Lieutenant Hammond, company commander, immediately exposed himself to the hostile fire to direct his men in clearing the enemy positions. During the fierce fight which ensued, he was painfully wounded by a fragment of a hand grenade. Refusing medical aid, he courageously moved among his men, encouraging them and directing their fire until the hill was taken. Although suffering from concussion, he determinedly supervised the defensive deployment of his men. As a result of the courage and leadership of Lieutenant Hammond, the company seized and held the objective. So that was number 2, Silver Star number 2. And the next day, letter number 16. So that was March 20th. March 21st, he wrote a letter home. 3/21/45. It says somewhere in Germany. constant faith in God, patience, and continued hope that this will soon be over will make all of us appreciative of God's favors. I know that my sister will never despair and that life will be good to you. I know that all the boys, when they come home, will have profited by their experiences and that family life will be more precious than ever. Happy birthday, sis. I was touched by that, just in that after being wounded, he doesn't talk about what happened, he doesn't mention anything about the recent battles. He just says, happy birthday. You can also get the sense that during the battles, the arc of his thinking. He started out with his letters being uncertain what was about to happen to him, worked his way into fighting. At this point, he's talking a lot more about faith and God and, survival that way. And ultimately, he starts talking about the future and looking forward to the future, having survived this. So while we were in Germany too, that second Silver Star was probably around Kaiserslautern. We also remembered the story about the boy who got baptized. And we found out that it was at St. Mary's Church in Hawkspire. So we thought, let's go to Hawkspire and just see what we can see. So we went, it was about an hour south of Kaiserslautern, and we got to Hawkspire and we looked for St. Mary's Church, and there wasn't a St. Mary's Church. And we asked if there ever was a St. Mary's Church, and they said there never has been a St. Mary's Church. So we thought maybe this was just one of those stories that we got inaccurate information about, imperfect information about, and maybe we won't be able to find it. So we said, is there any Catholic church here? They said, oh yeah, there's one. I said, oh, what's the name of it? St. Laurentius Church. That's not what we heard, but let's go take a look and see what it might be like. So we went to St. Laurentius Church, and we looked at the sign, and it said, St. Laurentius Church, St. Mary's Parish. And so we felt, oh, we got to it. So it was locked, it was closed, it was kind of an off day. And we saw two little kids who were playing around the church grounds. And we were just walking around the church. And eventually, kids being kids came up to us adults and said, what are you doing here? And we said, we told them a little bit of the story. And they said, oh, I'm from Miami. One of the kids, my dad's in Miami right now. And the other kid was from the Ukraine and had just come over from Ukraine. We did this whole trip in October of 2023, so it was after the invasion. And one of the kids said, oh, and if you want, the caretaker is sitting over there at the picnic table having a noon beer with his friends. And so we went over there and the caretaker said, oh, of course I'll let you in, and took us in. And we looked around, and as we looked around the church, there was this new baptismal font in the front and an altar in the chairs, and then in the back, there was an old baptismal font that was no longer being used. They said that would have been the baptismal font that was used in 1945. So again, with imperfect information, suddenly we bump into something like this. So just want to show this. I'm curious how well you can see it. This is a year's difference. This is my dad at 29 years old in Avellino, Italy, before he had any battle. And this was him 1 year later in Germany. It was a sketch that somebody did. Do you notice any differences?
Seen some things.
He'd seen some things. You can tell, can't you? His eyes, how he's carrying himself, just What a difference a year makes. So ultimately, my brothers and I decided to do a couple other things that weren't apparently on my dad's itinerary. One of them was my brothers, neither of my brothers had ever gone to a concentration camp before. I taught Poland one year, and so I had gone to Auschwitz-Birkenau. I went to Stutthof. I went to some of the other ones. They're sobering places, but we have to keep going to them. We have to keep visiting them. So we decided, since from where we were going to where Austria was, right in the middle, Dachau, right outside of Munich was there. And so we decided just because it was there and because my brothers had never seen a concentration camp to stop there as well and visit and see what was going on. And then we finished up the trip to Austria. And ultimately, my wife met us in Paris and my brothers went home and she and I went to Camp Lucky Strike to see where he had been let off. So at my father's funeral, May 7th, 2000, a 56-year-old man stood up and offered a eulogy. Good evening, he said. I would like to tell you a story. And he proceeded to talk about a conscripted laborer, a mess sergeant who knew a smattering of Polish, a company commander who organized a baptism. And the speaker closed with this. Today marks exactly 55 years, May 7th, 1945, since Gene first became a godfather. The Polish man has since died, about 4 years now. I can't help but feel that over these past few days, there has been a joyous, if not raucous, reunion between two very old and dear friends. One a former Army first lieutenant, the other a Polish immigrant. In closing, he continued, I would like to extend a wish to the Hammond children and grandchildren. I wish you the gifts of strength of character, of integrity, of loyalty, courage, kindness, and personal commitment and honor. All of these were the hallmarks of your father, of your grandfather. And he paused and concluded, of my godfather. So that's the story I wanted to tell. There is a postscript before you have some questions. There is a postscript. So I gave this talk in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where my dad was born, where he lived, where he raised us, where he was mayor of our city for 9 years.
Oh.
And at the end of the talk, an 80-year-old gentleman stood up. And it was this boy who had been baptized. And he said, I live 3 miles from here. My dad had been able to help the family after the war. The rules at the time, it took 4 years, but the rules at the time were you had to have a job for them and you had to have a place for them to live. If you could show that you had both those things, you could help bring people over. So he stood up and he said, can you come out to dinner with me? I said, sure. And he said, at dinner, he said, your dad left a bunch of photos with my parents because you didn't want them in your house during the war. As it was going.
Wow.
And I said, I would love to see those photos. He said, they're not photos that you really want to see, but they're photos that I think are part of the legacy. And it turns out that they were photos of the liberation of Dachau. And we don't know this for certain, but it's possible that my dad was part of that liberation. Remember, I talked about where that was and the timing of it, and so we're still doing research on whether that was part of what happened. So that's the postscript. So I think if you're willing, you've got people right near you. If you want to just say a few things that you're thinking about at the end of this talk about your own experience with World War II family members, or something in the story that brought something up, if you just take a minute to talk to each other, and then we'll have a time for questions, or if anybody wants to bring up their own story, that would be fun too. Okay, so just take a minute to think about the stories that you already have, and just chat with each other for a moment.
You know, my father last.
Yes.
The name, I don't.
No, you want to just spend almost all of it. Talk with yourself.
You want to look at that?
No, I put it on.
But.
Where your friend because they were friends in Germany. And finally, some of them said, we could use these as interrogators in Germany. No. So. But just as long as figures. No, I think it is. He would write the shares. Some some in German, some in. So, but the other they get through. Sure.
There's always more to I know. There's more to your stories, but does anybody want to share either a question or a story? Yeah, Dina?
I was just talking about the Ritchie boys, and I don't know if people are aware of who the Ritchie boys were, but the Camp Ritchie, and that's why they were called the Ritchie boys. The U.S. government decided that some of the refugees from Germany and Austria.
He's part of it. If you don't mind, there's a comment right here. We get to yours as well. Yep.
There is a point to this story.
This is the Ritchie brothers.
The Ritchie boys.
The Ritchie
So the U.S. government decided that a lot of these Austrian and German young male refugees, they would offer them citizenship. They could be in the U.S. Army, and they would then go to Europe, and they would help as interpreters. And there's a whole movie about them and a book about them. Well, I also went through family papers, and an uncle of mine by marriage, who was German, who was in this country, was a Ritchie boy. And when you talked about the letters from your dad, where he wrote somewhere in, it's exactly the same as these letters, somewhere in France, somewhere in Luxembourg.
Yeah, they were taught not to pinpoint themselves.
Where they were.
Yeah.
And the other thing that really got to me. Um, you said when your father got married,
Mm-hmm.
that he said, "Well, we've seen the worst," and I grew up thinking, "Yeah, the worst has already happened."
Mm-hmm.
No,
Right.
the worst. It's out there. It's always going to be out there.
Yeah.
We had this idea. And finally, a question.
Yeah.
How, and when you were growing up,
Mm-hmm.
what was your sense of how the war affected your father?
That's a great question. We didn't think about it too much. We didn't ask enough questions. I was one of the younger ones, so I didn't get a lot of the time when he was fresher from the war as well. But our conversations about the war were relatively gentle. He didn't talk about the bad things that happened. He talked about the men in his company who would do things like decorate themselves in tree branches and say, "Look, Lieutenant, I'm a camouflage," you know. Or he would be cooking breakfast for us on a Sunday morning, and he would pretend to be the French chef and use his French, and he would take an egg and he'd throw it up behind his back. Inevitably, it would crack on the ceiling and have everything drip down. He liked keeping things light. And so, in terms of PTSD or something like that, that they didn't talk about at the time, they said shell shock. I didn't get a strong sense that that was a big part of his life, and yet I didn't know his interior life. When we went for picnics, for example, at the local park, we would spread out the picnic on the army blanket. We called it the army blanket. It was his army blanket. What kinds of things did that get him thinking about? That's not what I was thinking about as a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old. But I'm sure it brought up memories for him that were important to him. But he never shared that with us. He never shared those kinds of stories with us. And that was one of the reasons we took this trip, so we could speculate and talk. And I would often, as we drove from place to place, pepper my brothers with questions so that we would just be able to think about things. Well, what do you remember about the stories that Dad told us? Not just about the Army, but in general. And what do those stories tell us about Dad? Or if you were to encapsulate this whole trip in one word, what word would you use? So another question. All right, Bill, we'll try our best. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
Well, I'm struck by this common theme of people coming back from the war and not talking about it. And that certainly was true of my father, who said to us, the one thing he did tell us was he was an old man when he came back. He was 27.
27.
So you think what that makes your dad. So in 1993, I took my son, I was on sabbatical, took my son John to the Normandy beaches. I said, "John, I'm not exactly sure where your grandfather landed. Let's give him a call." But they had those telecarriages back then. You could buy a certain number of minutes. So we called my dad in New Jersey, and I said, "Dad, we're in Normandy at." I'm going to get
That's
choked
okay. That's
up.
okay because it's an emotional thing. It's okay.
We're at Omaha Beach, and I wanted to tell John where he landed. And I hear my dad say, "Omaha Beach." Line went dead.
Yeah.
I just,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
And then he was very upset with me when we got home,
Yeah.
saying I caused him to start to reflect on that whole experience. Of course, then the next year, the country was celebrating what would that have been, 50th anniversary
Mm-hmm.
of the landing.
Yeah.
So it was all around.
1995.
And that's when he began to talk.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, good.
Yeah, yeah,
Good.
50 years later.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of it was internalized, and unfortunately, I think, because it may be just who can you talk to about this, and if you're with your old Army buddies, you could probably talk about it. But if you're with your family, it might be harder. I remember my dad appreciating later in his life he was able to go to Hawaii with my mother, and there was a hotel in Honolulu called the Halekoa, the home of the warrior, which was a special hotel for people who had been in the war. And he loved being able to go there and meet some of his buddies from the war and just be able to be with them. Singular experience, right? In a life that was pretty compact. You think about the people now who are going through horrific times and how they're going to be able to contend with it and deal with it. Yeah, it can.
Bill, did any of your siblings end up going to the Vietnam War? And if so, was your father able to talk with them?
The answer is no, nobody went to the Vietnam War, but my brother George, number 4, was drafted number 1.
Oh my.
And he got out of it for what he said, psychological reasons.
Mhm.
So he didn't have to go. He was involved in something called transcendental meditation at the time. And he said, you know, there's no way I can be anywhere involved in a war. And whatever argument he came up with, he did not go there. My oldest brother, Gene, who also went, was in the Navy for a little while. He was on a nuclear sub, but not for long because they found out he had asthma. He had never been diagnosed with asthma. They said, well, you can't be on a nuclear sub if you've got asthma. And he said, all right, so what's next? He said, well, we can transfer you to somewhere else, or you can be honorably discharged. And he said, if Vietnam had started, he said, I'll go for honorable discharge then. Yeah, so in terms of that experience, none of us had the experience that my father had in terms of being
I was
in the middle of
wondering if you would have communicated
with someone like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might have. Yeah, Bill?
Well, my father was also in World War II
Mhm.
in Europe, and he started out in England
Mhm.
and doing support activities for the troops. And then he came over to your D-Day 7 and became part of the attacking forces. He wasn't directly on the front line. He was managing the reserve soldiers. When they were needed, he would give them their assignments. But he was close to the battles. Like he was there for D-Day. And I'm sorry, the Battle of the Bulge,
Battle of the Bulge.
and, among other things. And yes, he talked a lot about his time during World War II in Europe, combating the Germans. But he really focused more, as you others have said, on what he learned there and the people he was with,
Mhm.
the fellow soldiers, and he kept contact with them during many years after
Mhm.
his time in the war. He even searched family when he was over there in
Mhm.
Europe, especially after the unconditional surrender.
Great.
And he told us a lot about all of that.
Mhm.
But the battle confrontations weren't the first thing to be discussed by any means. But he was also very impressed when he eventually ended up in Germany as an occupying force there, about how everything worked so well and functioned well, and the buildings were so solid.
Mhm.
And he brought home a German typewriter, which we still have.
Mhm.
And if I should have brought it in, it's so solid
Yeah.
when you type with it, with umlauts.
Yeah.
Yeah, we learned a lot from my dad about that.
Yeah.
And I'll just mention one other thing. You spoke of Dachau.
Mhm.
So I lived in Germany about 6 years. And we went to Dachau a few times when people would visit, we'd take them there. And it's really quite remarkable to see a place like that. You saw more than Dachau. But after the war ended and the German government came together again, a big topic was, should we destroy the Holocaust prisons or keep them as a remembrance of what horrible things we did and what people can do to each other. And the German parliament, Bundestag, voted to keep them. So not all of them, but
Right.
they kept Dachau and Auschwitz and some other ones because they wanted to have the world see what horrible things people could do to each other and as a learning experience. So that was quite interesting. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, Sue.
Well, I have a story from a little different perspective, is that, and I've always wondered about this, is my aunt and uncle had just been recently married at the time he was drafted. And he was drafted in the middle of the war and was gone for 2.5 years. And he would write letters home all the time explaining that she must not worry, he was safe. She knew he was somewhere in Europe and she was frantic and she prayed every night. And it was just, she said, just wonderful knowing that his letters were coming, but incredibly difficult for her and her family.
Sure.
And when the war was over, she discovered that he had spent 2.5 years at Oak Ridge, Tennessee,
Oh, really?
and had never come to us. And he wasn't allowed to say everything he wrote was censored, everything.
Sure.
And she said, you know, in my deepest heart, at some point, I never forgave him. Such a difficult time.
I understand that too.
A lot of wives that were left behind. And she, I mean, they had just been married, but she then did have a baby that she was taking care of. And she thought, you know, will he ever see his father? Will he?
Well, you tell from the number of gravestones that a lot of people didn't. That battle at Monte Cassino, half the people died in that 142nd Regiment.
Right.
Half the Americans died in that first wave.
Yeah.
And they needed a month before they could get the replacements for them. Now, my grandmother, my dad's mother, that's the way it works, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. My grandmother had 6 boys in the war at the
Oh,
same time
wow.
in different places around.
Wow.
I can't imagine the emotional struggle that she had to deal with.
Oh. Wow.
So the whole goal here is still to think about, what kind of journey, either physical journey or other journey you might do with family members of your own, or maybe, some of you already have done that it's a great way of connecting with family and with our history. People who have done things to try to get our world a little bit better. And there are people that always work to try to get our world a little bit better. And there are always people who try to get the world a little bit for themselves. Right? And that is one of those battles that continue on. My dad was not naive to that. Early on in the war, in one of his letters, he writes, well, this is a big war. We're trying to do what we can. Who knows, leaders in 20 years will probably start another one, but let's get this one done. Let's get this one completed. Thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you to all you Zoomers.